fella, this guy, Travis Dickinson, we met at the Southwest Seminary debate, and extremely nice guy. He was very good to me and James, and we're really looking forward to his book, Stand Firm. But this is the real deal. This guy teaches philosophy and so forth at Southwestern Seminary. So what do you think, Rod? Are you excited about that?
Yeah, well, I'm always excited.
All right.
I'm easily
So
excited.
anyway, pass him out. And he'll, and the subtitle is The Brilliance of the Gospel. No bias there at all, no.
So is he going to be able to come to our...
Yes! The most important thing, thank you, Ken, he is going to be here. In person. So,
So the Christian delusion is not biased.
not at all. So anyway, they briefly mentioned the chapter Jesus, the Failed Apocalyptic Prophet. Let me explain a little bit about apocalyptic thought in Judaism. For 2 centuries before Jesus appeared on the scene, you had this apocalyptic thought. And what it encompasses is that the end of the world is coming soon, where you got to remember the Jews were under subjugation from the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans. So they were thinking, how come we're suffering and we're doing things right? Well, it's the reason being because God's going to come, the imminent Son of Man or whatever is going to come and set everything right. The rich, remember Jesus, the rich will be poor like Lazarus, where the poor guy is in heaven and the rich guy is down in hell saying, hey, help me get out of this place. So Dale Allison wrote a book, and he's a Christian, by the way. Jesus, the New Millenarian. Oh, thank you, Ken. What's the name of the book, Ken?
Jesus of Nazareth, Millenarian Prophet.
So the current thought that since 1906, when Albert Schweitzer wrote his great book, about Jesus, the popular consensus has been is Jesus is best viewed as an apocalyptic prophet that was a man of his times. Apocalyptic thought was throughout Judea, throughout his history, and he was, as Dale Allison says, it's page 1319 if you'd like to follow in your Bibles. He says there's certain things that John the Baptist preached. Remember, Jesus was impressed with John the Baptist preaching. He was a follower of John the Baptist. Remember, John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Jesus didn't baptize him. But real quickly, what it has in common is the kingdom of God, the future reward, future judgment, persecution of the saints, victory over the evil powers, a sense that something new is here at hand, the importance of John the Baptist and references to the Son of Man. So Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist, and you remember what John the Baptist said, hey, near, this king was right around the corner.
He didn't say that to Jesus.
Well, he was saying to the people.
Yeah.
And Jesus, what the consensus is Jesus went along with his message and then made it his own message. And you can see it in remember the Sons of Thunder, John and so forth saying, or I think it's their mother says, hey, who's going to sit at the right and who's going to sit at the left? We want in on this new kingdom. And Jesus was going to be the new leader, and the 12, what were the 12 apostles going to do? They were going to rule the 12 tribes of Israel. So in the other evidence that Jesus was an apocalyptic figure and had this view that the end was coming very soon. Well, the one thing he says, you won't enter all the towns of Israel before you see the Son of Man coming in power. So it wasn't a spiritual thing. It was but the other thing, our earliest Christian letter by Paul, 1 Thessalonians in 52 AD, says, Paul's saying, hey, don't quit your day jobs. The end is coming, but not just yet. But they all thought it was right around the corner. So anyway, that gives you an overview of, apocalyptic thought. Am I right there, Ken? Are you following?
Yeah, and I think that apocalypticism, if you read Dale Allison's excellent book, he documents instances of apocalypticism within and outside of the Jewish and Christian traditions, including in Amerindian contexts or cargo cults.
Now, with the war scrolls by the Qumran community be an example of that?
Yes, they were apocalyptic as well.
So it's all over the place.
He lists like 16 different attributes shared in common among all apocalyptic groups.
Wow.
And details them in great depth. It's very fascinating.
So boil this down for us laymen. A lot of people believed that there was going to be an end to the world, an apocalypse.
Yeah, for 200 years before Jesus came.
And predicted it.
Right, within and outside the Christian and Jewish traditions, yes. It's a very common human trope, I guess you could say.
But in Bart Ehrman, a renowned scholar, he's the guy that writes the textbooks on New Testament that are read in every university. His book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, lays out his case. So, it's just, to me, it's hard to argue with the fact that Jesus thought the world was coming to an end. He was, as John says in the book, it failed, so he's basically a false prophet and nothing else.
Well, rather than bludgeoning you with my dart gun.
Oh, now it's bludgeoning now.
Well, the darts haven't seemed to.
Just give it time.
Instead of that, why don't we see what's in the next interview?
Fine.
Okay. Is that okay, Brady?
That sounds all right. Here we go.
A gun without ammunition is just a club.
Yes.
Follow-up question for you. If Jesus was at best a failed prophet, what would he have been at worst?
Now, this is from the perspective of Christianity.
Yes.
At best, Christians admit Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, and they'll say as much so. I mean, Christianity is not a monolithic type of entity. There's all kinds of different beliefs, and many of them, not too many of them, will embrace the fact that, yes, Jesus was wrong. Thomas Stark does it in his book, Face of God. So at best, he's a failed apocalyptic prophet, and at worst, he didn't exist. So that would be the worst for Christian faith.
Yeah, let me ask you, maybe at worst a mere myth, because you've already implied. Let me just say, I watched one of your recent debates with David Wood, and you stated several times during that debate that you were not a mythicist. But in your book, The Christian Delusion, it relies heavily on mythicism as advanced by Richard Carey and Robert Price. So my question, John, are you actually a closeted myther, or just sympathetic to mythicism?
I'm sympathetic. I think that there's a couple of things that are hard to get around, and I'm presently undergoing some thoughts along those lines. But
I know you're open-minded and you look at both sides. So have you read? He's agnostic as well, but have you read Bart Ehrman's book-length work on that?
I have it. I have not read it. I skimmed through it. He really got me when his book that was subsequent to that one, and he said, we almost certainly know this, we almost certainly know that, we almost certainly know this, we almost certainly know that. And I as I was reading him, I was saying, there's something wrong. I mean, with this refrain, you can't know anything with certainty in history, much less supernatural claims. So I thought, as I was reading this, When Jesus Became God, I think was the title of the book. And I thought to myself, wow, he's really going overboard here, saying things that are clearly inaccurate, for a historian to say. And so that actually convinced me not to read his former book, Why Jesus Exists. Oh, yeah, because anybody who's saying those sorts of things can't be relied on in his previous book, although I haven't, and I've just read other things that seem to have more to say. Than someone who's going to say, we almost certainly know Jesus did this, or we almost certainly know Jesus did that.
In our book club last year, we actually did both books. We did Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, and then we also got the anthology about how God became Jesus, which was the Christian rebuttal to that book. And we were able to deal with that, both of those questions. So the club's somewhat familiar with that particular book. But, we watched, during that book club, we watched a clip from Bart Ehrman receiving the Emperor Has No Clothes Award from one of the national atheist associations. And he basically took them apart and said that no one in any who have an earned degree in that field and teaches at any reputable university is going to side with you on this.
I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who, I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but again, I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. You are much better off going with historical evidence and arguing historically rather than coming up with the theory that Jesus didn't exist.
And he said, "You are embarrassing us if you teach the Jesus myth theory. That you're embarrassing the atheist world."
Well, then tell him, if you ever get him on your program, that John Loftus says that Bart Ehrman, you are embarrassing atheists because we are the party of reason and evidence. And in your book, When Jesus Became God, you say we know Jesus certainly did this, or he certainly did that. We don't know anything about like that, and I think it's time for you to fess up and apologize for saying that as a historian, because a historian cannot say that. About like that, and I think it's time for you to fess up and apologize for saying that as a historian, because a historian cannot say that.
Funny. He always says almost certain. He never says certain. Yeah. So you can make that distinction.
And that's quite a
I take
leap
his point.
to go from saying almost certainly no to certainly no.
And he's not, John Dominic Crossan, who's as liberal as they get, said that Jesus baptized in the River Jordan by John the Baptist and that he was crucified by the Romans is historically certain as anything can be historically. So that's John Dominic Crossan, who's a real legitimate scholar, one of the best in New Testament around. And the reason being the criteria of embarrassment, that why is Jesus being baptized by John? If you were trying to make this up, you would switch it and have John, in the later Gospels, they find it problematic and they go, no, you should be baptizing me. So they correct Mark, Matthew, and the later Gospels. And of course, the crucifixion, we see people with crosses and on churches and all. At that time, it was a terrible, ignominious death that you would never go and have your founder experience. So that's why we believe Jesus is and what he said, early multiple sources. We have Mark and Thomas and the Acts of the Apostles and Q and Matthew. These are independent things that have differences, which leads you to believe that this is probably historical. And the go-to passage is Galatians 1:18, where he says, like he said, where Paul goes with no seeming agenda and says, I met with Peter, his closest disciple, and James' brother. So, and he's absolutely right. The atheists are just really hurting themselves by going this fifth right. Even someone like John Loftus, which is surprising, don't you think, guys?
Yeah. And then Richard Carrier is in that camp.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting what you can find out about these guys by just looking at Wikipedia, too.
Mm-hmm. Now, and there is some the reason they believe, the main reason is because Paul doesn't seem to know anything about Jesus. He never mentions his parables. He doesn't mention the miracles. You would think he would say, "Oh, remember when Lazarus?" He doesn't seem to know much about Jesus' teachings when they would reinforce his point of view.
Virgin birth.
Virgin birth, empty tomb. The empty tomb. He doesn't. He says he was raised from it, but he doesn't mention the empty tomb. So it just seems like these gospel writers, 20 years later than Paul, are just creating these Jesus stories. Like obviously Mark doesn't have a birth narrative. A lot of Christians don't realize this. Matthew and Luke make up, imaginary, fictitious birth
You need to
narratives.
get some new material.
Well, I mean,
Tell us that every
some of
time.
these people don't. I try to be short. So what do y'all think of? Go on.
Loftus doesn't like history. He just doesn't. He likes science a lot, and he says, this is one thing that struck me. He has this outsider's view of science. Okay, I got a biochemistry degree, I got master's and PhD in linguistics, which sometimes is scientific. But he treats science as kind of naively, I think. Like, there's nothing you can know without science. Okay, forget history, forget police investigations terrifically today, forget any written records. And it's just like, this is a real kind of a very anti-historical thing. So anything coming up historically, he has no truck with, really. And so I think that's, also, he says, there's no such thing as an atheistic worldview, and I think he's exhibiting it through his whole article, though. Yeah. But I was just thinking, if you throw out history altogether, you're not left with a whole lot.
Well, go ahead, Bill.
One thing, Hebrews is looked at as a bad book. Nobody understands it. Nobody wants to quote it. Hebrews is something that it's in the Bible, but people don't want to accept that.
Yeah, Brady.
Yeah, Brady had an alternate view. We were discussing this before the meeting, and he believes Jesus isn't a failed apocalyptic prophet.
I'm with Brady.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brady.
Yeah, I don't think there's any evidence. I mean, what he gives as his verse here is what's seen in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's wild because if you just isolate the one sentence, that one phrase, then oh my goodness, this is he's a failed prophet. Let's sleep in on Sunday, right? But the problem is when you read the context of the passage, and I don't understand how he got there. And I challenge you. I mean, for those of you who read the book, you can go back into any of the synoptic accounts and start at the very beginning of the chapter and work your way down. There's one. I guess it's verse 7 or so. I have to go back and look. There's a key word there, and it's a pivot and a hinge. It's like but, and he goes and Jesus is talking and he says, look. This is what's going to happen, but you don't need to be worried. There's going to be earthquakes. There's going to be wars and rumors and wars, and nations are going to rise up against nations. Hey, don't worry about that. Those things are going to happen. There's going to be antichrists that are going to come. Even by the nature of what he's saying, he is saying that this isn't going to happen anytime soon.
Is that Matthew?
It's Matthew, Mark,
And then he kind of
Luke.
continues on that, so that gives you kind of the time frame, right? But he's also saying that, he does talk about apocalyptic. The kingdom is
Right around the corner.
yeah, right. And the kingdom of God is like, right? But he also talks about that it's at hand, and he is somewhat of there is some social aspect associated with it, right? I haven't come to abolish the law. You have the aspect of the Sermon on the Mount and all those kinds of things. Well, why would you do that if you're immediately going to have this apocalyptic thing? Also, he's doing this claiming to be God over and over again, which kind of makes it a little bit different. I was kind of talking about this a little bit before. It kind of makes, like Chris's argument, is different if the person claims to be God and is raised. I mean, we're doing preponderance of evidence, right? It makes a big difference to me in my faith if the guy that was on the gurney raised, and before that he told me he was God and he was going to do it, right? And so that kind of gets back to what Ken was saying. If you assume the resurrection based off of evidence associated with the apostles themselves, that why would they die if they if it was untrue, or what was the purpose of what they were doing, and they were certainly kind, and it seemed they believed what they thought, right? Okay, and we just talked about Paul. So it kind of gets into, I mean, all of this is getting into, what is, he's saying, okay, for the more miraculous, right, I need the greater probable of evidence, right? And so it just kind of adds to some of this probable evidence. We kind of look at, somewhat improbable that we're all alive and that we're all in this meeting and we're having a debate and we're talking about important things, right?
But I want to get back to Ken. Ken, right, what do you think of that? Did Jesus mean when he said this generation will not pass away till you see the Son of Man coming in, or you will not go to all the towns in Israel before? Was he talking about then, or was he talking as what Brady says about a future event?
Well, see, I want to take a step back and get back to, I'll come to this, but I want to preface it by reiterating again the need for the outsider test of faith. I had a Mormon friend in high school, and I read up on Mormonism, and from an evangelical perspective, I was looking for ways to trap him, so to speak. And I found this place that talked about where there was a river in the ancient Near East in a certain location, and lo and behold, that river doesn't exist. So I go to him thinking, aha, I got you. This river that the Book of Mormon talks about doesn't exist. Well, of course, he comes up with the idea, well, maybe it was there, but it disappeared since then. Okay. Well, so we laugh at that, but I think that if you're within a particular perspective, your instinctive reaction is to be defensive and come up with a solution for that problem.
Absolutely.
Rather than to acknowledge that, yes, I'm part of this system, therefore I should be even more skeptical of my own inherited faith than I tend to be of other people's faith, in order to compensate for our illegitimate tendency to give our own.
So what evidence do you have that he was talking about that generation?
Well, so if you think about human nature and all these other different cults and movements, where both inside and outside of Christianity and Judaism, when these apocalyptic pronouncements are made, they are always made for the generation living at
That's
the
a good
time
point.
that the people make the pronouncements.
How do you know that again?
Just historically, all of the movements, all the apocalyptic movements that are detailed in this book.
Other than Christian.
Right. Yeah. So the pattern, the template of apocalypticism is that whatever's going to happen is going to happen in this generation, and that makes sense from a naturalistic perspective.
But does it follow the Jesus statement about this generation?
So we'll get to that. So I'm just saying.
Does that follow?
I'm trying to build a kind of a background case here. So thinking of it as a black box without you knowing what he was saying specifically, the odds are that any apocalyptic movement is going to have the assumption that whatever's being talked about, that is going to happen in that generation. That's already I'm making a probabilistic argument. Because who cares about what's going to happen 1,000 years from now? A person living today, Hal Lindsey didn't care about what was going to happen 1,000 years from now. He cared about what was going to happen in his lifetime, right? Just like any good apocalypticist.
Yeah.
But then you look at the dozens of passages in the scripture where it talks about the hour is at hand. We who are alive will meet him in the cloud, and we who are alive on earth today will meet him in the clouds. That's Paul talking in 1 Thessalonians. He includes himself in that group. So it's not just one passage that this hinges off of, and you can't just say, okay, you can plug that hole by saying, oh, well, if I say this generation and it really means that generation, I can get out of that. No, you're not getting out of that, because the context of the whole New Testament is strongly supportive of a worldview in which Jesus is returning in that generation. So I think I get offended when Christians blindly dismiss, this very real problem. Read this book. Read.
So, but wait, hold on.
Go ahead.
But what evidence do you have? I mean, what evidence do you have that within Christianity that Jesus would come back within that generation? Is it just Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because I got the passage right here, and I'd like to read it to everybody. And I mean, you can tell me.
Which passage do you have in mind?
Well, Luke 21. They're all pretty much the same. Actually, Matthew is even a little bit better, because it's just implied that there's two things being asked in Luke. In Matthew, it's implicitly stated. So, but anyway, in Luke chapter 21 and verse number 5, some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." And of course, that's reference to 70 AD when that actually happened. And then the disciples asked this. "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" He replied, "Watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But," this is verse 12, "but," that's a pivot, a hinge. Things are about to change. I'm telling you this is going to happen, but before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me, but make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life." And then it continues on. "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars on the earth. Nations will be in anguish, perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken at the time. They will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because redemption is drawing near."
But Brady, that is the gospel writer saying those words. That's not Jesus saying those words.
Bill, you can't
How
have
it-
it both
he's
ways.
showing, it's like he has a video showing
Bill, if we follow your logic, then Jesus isn't a failed apocalyptic prophet.
No, you're absolutely right. It gets him out of the jam.
Well,
but it's like he's describing the sack of Jerusalem. How much clearer can it be? Go ahead.
So
More than
I'll read a much shorter passage.
Well, I mean, we're really getting into it in verse 29, because he told them this parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know the kingdom of God is near." And then here it is. "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened."
What generation?
What generation?
That's the million-dollar
And
question.
what was he just talking about in the previous
That was the reason why I read the entire passage.
okay.
Because
Well,
all these things have to happen. You have to have
No,
I
grace.
see your
You have
point.
to-
Go ahead.
and until
I'll
these
read
things
another-
happen.
That's reasonable.
You can-
Yeah, go
I'll
ahead,
read
Ken.
another short passage, but I
Yeah.
want to just respond very briefly to that, the point he's making. Who is it that he's referring to? He's talking to you, the disciples, right, who are alive on earth with Jesus. So he's addressing it
Yes.
to his disciples.
He was talking to them.
There is no, the parameters here are the generation. It's not, wars can come and go, all these things can happen, but it's still within the generation, which is pointed out in Matthew 16. And I know that the standard response is going to be, well, it's followed by the transfiguration, but I'll show why that does not apply. Matthew 16, 26, "What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." So this is more than just a visit on a mountaintop and a transfiguration. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Right.
So, and I know that this is the well, the river disappeared, like my Mormon friend said. Well, there's a transfiguration after this. Well, they think this is cause for dismissing what Jesus said about him coming in his kingdom to reward people with his holy angels.
Is it dismissing it,
but
or
wait,
is
hold on.
it explaining it?
I think you got two questions. How does Jesus say he's coming back in Luke? And by the way, it says the same thing in the other Gospels, in the other Synoptics. How did Jesus say he's coming back?
On the clouds with his angels.
Okay. What does he say in the passage you just read? How are they going to see him?
Come in his Father's glory with his angels.
Okay. Now,
and then
what
he will reward-
did they see of the transfiguration?
They didn't see angels, or Jesus didn't reward people for their deeds.
What does angels mean? What is angelos, the Greek word? You know what it means. What does it mean?
Yeah, you're the
messenger.
Okay.
Right.
And who was with him on the Mount of Transfiguration?
Well, there's Moses and Elijah, and Peter was there as well. I mean, but this is not a description of the
How did they see him?
Transfiguration.
So they didn't see him in a glorified state when he was on the Mount of Transfiguration?
And he will reward each person according to what they have done, before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
But
This is not the kingdom.
But the reward.
Well, wait, hold on. In Matthew, when he's getting baptized by John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of God is at hand. That's
Right.
all throughout the New Testament. The Transfiguration absolutely shows those guys before they tasted death seeing God in His glory.
Neil, do you have something?
I was just going to say, you might look at this, and I could be, wrong, but that when the Holy Spirit was given to people, that was in fact again God and Christ in that sense, bringing the kingdom in and allowing the rest of His message to proceed. So in that sense, He came before they visited all the cities in Israel.
Well, it could be, but anyway, Renee, do you have any comments from the Facebook folks? We don't
No,
want to
we
leave
haven't
them.
had anything since we came back.
Oh, I thought you said.
I mean, I appreciate
Thank you for checking though.
I appreciate the attempt to try to dovetail that with the transfiguration, but I just don't think it fits.
Well, actually, you
because
brought it up, not
uh,
us.
And then he will reward, because I know that standard apologists.
You want to shoot him with the dart?
Yes.
And then he will reward each person according to what they have done. That speaks of the apocalypse. This is not just a visit with three guys on a mountain.
Or perhaps end times.
Right, and it echoes the language that Brady was reading in Luke, after all these events and these things taking place. There was also, Loftus pointed out in his chapter about the curious case in John where it talks about, well, did I say I was going to come before my beloved disciple died? No, I said, what is that to you if I tarry until after he...
Yeah, and John, written in 100 AD, 90
Yeah,
AD,
so there's-
they'd given up on him coming back,
There's
which is another good
little
evidence.
clues that they were struggling, or they were grappling with the fact that he hadn't come back yet when they had expected him. Even Paul, we who are alive and remain will be caught up in the clouds with him in the air. There was a very real, and I don't appreciate people who dismiss the reality of the real expectation that Jesus would return in that generation. This is massively
Now,
attested
in
throughout
John,
the New
in
Testament.
Revelation, does he think that, is he talking about Nero, and is he talking about that generation, or is he thinking 2,000 years
We
ahead?
can't do Revelation tonight, Phil.
I mean, I'm just real
Well,
quick.
John wasn't really, he wasn't on board with
I'm taking a class.
this generation. He
Revelation.
had already given up on that.
Here's the thing, though. Jesus, in his ministry on earth, so he walks with 12 disciples for 3.5 years. And in that whole time, his closest disciples misunderstood him completely.
Yeah.
When he tells them very plainly, I'm going to die, on more than one occasion. Then he dies, and they all get really disheartened, and then he rises from the dead, and suddenly they have more of a revelation. But if they walked with him for 3.5 years, completely misunderstood his mission, I just don't think that it's that unlikely that they misunderstood parts after he rose and ascended. Jesus spoke in parables, And so this idea that just because, like, for a couple of scriptures, like this generation, like, that we aren't misunderstanding parts of it, and that I don't think it's that unbelievable that his disciples misunderstood it in their generation too. They clearly thought he was going to come in that generation. It doesn't mean that's what he meant.
Why wasn't he, if he wasn't coming in this generation, and when he says this generation, he means some unknown future generation, why isn't that clearer?
I don't know.
So important?
I mean, there's plenty of questions that I have, but I just don't see that it's this big gaping.
I think he's talking about that generation because he's talking to his disciples.
But Ken, if you take it in context, go back to what he read. Read what comes just before it. He's talking about people who will see all these incredible end times events.
His disciples,
and then he says this generation will not pass.
His disciples he's talking to.
He's talking to them, but he's telling them about the future.
Right.
And he's saying that they're going to be incredible nations against nations, and that reports of things that's going to be more horrible than anything you've ever seen. And he's saying, and this generation will not pass.
This is not just a skeptical interpretation. I'll read C.S. Lewis. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message, excuse me here. The facts then are these, that Jesus professed himself in some sense ignorant, and within a moment showed that he really was so. To believe in the incarnation, to believe that he is God, makes it hard to understand how he could be ignorant, but also makes it certain that if he said he could be ignorant, then ignorant he could really be. For a God who can be ignorant is less baffling than a God who falsely professes ignorance. And he was referring to Jesus' claim that he would return in that generation. So C.S. Lewis accepted at face value Jesus' teaching that he was going to return in that generation, but he accepts that Jesus was ignorant about it. Just as
what book or article is that from?
It's let's see, 1960. It's World's Last Night in 1960.
So an article, not a okay.
But that, by the way, that position is an accepted position within certain Catholic theologians as well. That in order to Christ wept, and a variety of things happened. Which, by the way, I'll also mention that he made many predictions, and most of them came true. Particularly, startling prediction that the temple would be torn to shreds, which at the time, was pretty crazy. But I think the issue is that it's a bit of a dilemma. But if you're going to say he's truly man and truly God, then there would, to some extent, be evidence that he may not have been able to say everything that the God would say. And it gets into that situation where, if you remember, there's verses where Jesus sort of says, "Well, I'm not going to tell you everything right now." Right. Remember, and so that's also a position where you have to say, well, it's possible that what he was trying to communicate and what he wanted to kick off with his being here could only be delivered in a certain limited manner. And that's a position people have taken.
Well, what's really sad is the way people have cashed in. Ever since Hal Lindsey wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, when we were growing up, and it's like I remember Josh McDowell, when I was going to college, saying, I think he's coming back right in the next 20 or 30 years, and I'm going, hey, why even waste time here? So
the 70s were pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And
but this
guy,
Hal Lindsey, goes to Dallas Theological Seminary just up the road, gets his little cliff notes from class, turns it into this huge bestseller with all sorts of mistakes. Like, remember the common market, the European common market had 10 members. He goes, oh my gosh, that's the 10 horns we're in. The helicopters are big grasshoppers. Yeah. And then it turns out, there's 27 members of this fact,
It's starting to leave now, so maybe it'll go back down to 10.
And then he goes and revises everything with the Middle East being more of a part. He goes, oh yeah, that's why, forget the Gog and Magog, So he just revived, he's still on TV, not to mention the Left Behind people, Go ahead. Okay, and with this Revelation class I'm taking with Todd, it's like they argue premillennial, postmillennial, omnimillennial, and it's like it never occurs to him that he's probably not coming back. There's probably not going to be any millennial at all, but they just assume that it's just gospel truth.
Gospel truth?
I mean, I have to say this one point is, you probably sense a little bit of passion on my part, because it is one of the things that, as I was struggling with my faith, gave me closure, in a sense, because I realized I was the Mormon explaining away the river that disappeared. There's so many passages that push in that same direction, and it frustrates me that the reluctance for Christians to take a step back and say, hey, yeah, you know what? Odds are this is like any other apocalyptic movement where it had to happen within that generation. And furthermore, we see the evidence throughout the New Testament, so many different passages all pointing in the same direction. Yeah, you can pick out and say, well, this generation or that generation. You can say, well, maybe this was the transfiguration. But I'm talking about the whole picture. Let me just read a few of them. The world and its desires pass away. As it is now, will not last much longer, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour.
Oh, he says this is the last hour. What's the context of that?
In his day.
What hour is the last hour? What's he talking about?
He's talking about the situation in his day.
You don't think he's talking about the end of the world last hour?
No, Antichrists are already arising. This is how we know this. We're in the last hour. This is what he's saying to his readers in 1 John.
Hour does not mean 60 minutes in that context.
I agree. It's
figurative,
but it is within his lifetime.
Yeah. Well,
according to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly, this is Paul speaking, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. The Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of the Lord of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we, Paul, who are still alive and are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. The time has been shortened, this is Paul again, so that from now on, both those who have wives should be as though they had none. And those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. There's no time for marriage or buying or selling, only in a state of holy matrimony the elect remain.
So Ken, are you saying that somehow Paul got the message that Jesus was coming back soon from his early followers?
It's massively attested throughout. I could keep reading and reading and reading if time would permit. And it's frustrates me that every time I read a passage, it's like, oh, wait a minute, what did he? Well, I'm just saying, look at the big picture.
No, I got you. So,
yeah, I mean, there's some common ground, I have with Ken on this. That was an issue with the church in Thessalonica. I mean, they're sitting there thinking, I mean, literally, they're sitting up like this, just waiting for him to come back, and Paul's like, hey, we got to, get back to work. Hey, Christians have been saying for 2,000 years his return is imminent, and
yeah, you look at the Jehovah's Witnesses in 1940. Hey, he's coming back. 1970. Oh, well, I guess that was wrong. 1970. He's coming back. Whatever. So finally, 75. He came back, but it was spiritual. You guys missed it, but we're right on this. So it's just like, I mean,
and
this stuff
reflects the what is the preterists now are saying, like Wright will say, oh, it was just a spiritual. There was something that happened at the time of the AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then Jesus' spirit came.
Which hasn't really caught on the preterist view.
Yeah, it has a niche, but those people are very critical of those who ignore what the passages are saying.
We probably need to go to a video here pretty soon. Let me open a can of worms, if I may. Do you think that the author of Matthew made up that Jesus said those things?
Can you repeat that?
Do you think the author of Matthew just made all that stuff up about what Jesus said?
I have no way of knowing. I mean, there may have been a germ there of what Jesus actually said, but did he record it verbatim? Probably not. But there's probably some additions.
Well, in the book,
interesting thought.
In the book, Ron, really far out theory, they say that his followers put apocalyptic message into Jesus' mouth. So there's lots of theories. It's fascinating,
Let's hit the video.
Good idea.
Let's go to video. Maybe John will explain the generation.
popcorn.
Yeah. Well, let me say on that point, when we were discussing your book last month, Frank Turek was here with us in the book club, and so Bill was explaining this outsider test of faith, and how many of us have heard of that and this kind of thing. And the irony was, as we looked at each other, every one of us were the opposite of that. So Bill himself is a former Christian who's now an atheist. I'm a former Mormon who's now a Christian. Frank Turek is a former atheist, now Christian, and you are a former Christian, now atheist. And so it's just like there's a whole lot of people that kind of break that rule, wouldn't you say?
Well, I don't know that people break the rule for reasonable reasons. I mean, for good reasons. I mean, there are people becoming Christian in Asia and the southern hemisphere by the boatloads. I mean, but I don't think they're coming to Christianity out of whatever they're leaving from good reasons.
But you would argue that nobody becomes a Christian for a good reason.
Well, of course I would. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But here's the reason. I mean, because we're looking for sufficient objective evidence commensurate with the claim. And the outsider test asks people to do that. They ask people to do to their own faith what they do to the faiths they reject.
Let me get you to do one thing for me. That's just switch. A major part of our discussion tonight is going to be on this outsider test of faith. So from the author himself, and I think you're the one, not just that wrote the book on it, but you basically kind of pioneered this whole area, best I can tell. Could you just give us a really succinct definition from your own lips of an outsider test of faith?
Well, the basis of it is the fact that now we know a whole ton of cognitive biases that affect us all. The mother of all cognitive biases, I argue, is faith itself, but the psychologist community probably won't go with that. But if that one doesn't work, then the mother of all cognitive biases is confirmation bias, where you seek to confirm that which you prefer to believe. And I do that because, and Christians say, well, I really don't want to believe in Christianity. It says I'm a sinner, I'm going to hell. Well, you really do. You just don't. You're just trying to deny it because I've brought it up. That's all.
Well, let me ask you this. Do atheists ever have confirmation bias? Any atheists?
Oh, yeah. No, I already said that. We all have confirmation bias. We're looking for that which confirms what we believe. And that's back to what I said earlier. What we have to do, if we want to be honest, is we have to actively seek for disconfirming faith. Now, there's disconfirming evidence for what we believe. And people just don't do that because they are infected with a virus called cognitive bias. But here's what atheists do that believers don't. Now, you switched faiths. Now, in my opinion, you switched delusions. You just don't know it. I mean, there's no more objective evidence for your faith as there was archaeological evidence for the Mormon faith. You just don't see that yet because you are seeking to confirm faith. For you, faith is what you love. You love faith. It makes you feel good to have it, to know that you have a buddy named Jesus. Not to be too offensive, I don't mean to be that, but you haven't actually done what you need to do, and that is to do the same thing to your own as you've done to the Mormon faith, and look at the archaeological evidence. Now, I have a book called Christianity in the Light of Science. I have 3 chapters on archaeology, and you ought to read those. I mean, one's about the Exodus, one's about the city of Nazareth, and one is by the present editor of Biblical Archaeological Review, and he talks about how archaeology went through a phase where it was dominated by Christians who wrote their articles and did their findings under Christian assumptions. He says that's no longer the case. No longer the case is the idea that Jericho was toppled by, Joshua, but there's other reasons. It's a later date and all that kind of stuff. So look at those sorts of things and see how you think. But what you need is to do sufficient objective evidence commensurate with the claim. And your claim is just as supernaturally biased as the Mormon claim. And thus it records the extraordinary evidence that you
well,
said.
In some cases, even you have to acknowledge that there's been corroborating evidence, maybe not extraordinary evidence, but just like Jesus is now, many atheists think he was totally a mythical character. The same was said of Pontius Pilate. Till at Caesarea Maritima, recently they found the inscription with his name on it. And so
recently, I think I was 18 years old when they had that. Am I wrong?
in the history of in 2,000 years of Christian history, that would still be fairly recently. I know both of us are about the same age, and we're pretty old now.
I guess we'll allow that one.
Okay. But you would agree with that? There's been some corroborating evidence that has offset some of the criticisms.
All right, fair enough. Now there is that element that takes place, and just because, all right, let's say a skeptic would say, well, we need extraordinary evidence, and we're not going to believe that Pilate existed unless there's evidence for that. That was a reasonable supposition. That was still a reasonable thing to require, even before there was evidence that Pilate existed, based on the Gospels where there's supernatural goings on. So they were proved wrong, but they were still right to require that. And that means that there are going to be some things you believe or you disbelieve, that you do so based on the requirement. Okay? I get that. I understand that. And that's just the nature of the beast.
Well, I've got one more for you, and on this one, if this is something that's not a good question or inappropriate or something like that, let me know, and I'll just cut it out. But I did have a question for you. In your book, Why I Became an Atheist, you share about several devastating life events that preceded, and I think 3 different people that preceded your deconversion. And one of them you candidly discussed was your affair with a woman named Linda, while serving as in the capacity of a Christian minister. At our book club, we strongly discourage ad hominem attacks, believing that the strength or weakness of an argument should stand or fall on its own merits and not by the messenger. Nevertheless, it is not only true that ideas have consequences, but it's also true that consequences sometimes have ideas. What would you say to critics who suggest that your deconversion could have been a result of emotional or moral failings and the unloving, unchristian reaction you received from many of your professing Christian friends?
Well, yeah, when all else fails, just to bring that up, so that's okay. I don't mind. I share it for a reason. Here's the reason. Well, first off, I was a Christian when those things were happening, and I was struggling with my faith because I didn't expect some of those things. The kind of treatment I received from Christians and still receive from Christians who are supposedly filled with the Holy Spirit and loving and caring. So that's if the Holy Spirit can't do any better with you than that, then I don't want to be a part of that. But I mean that's evidence the Holy Spirit doesn't exist at all, because you would think that Christians would be the best people in the world. I mean, they say they should rise above the crowd in the things they do. But as a pastor, I'm telling you, they don't. If you want to not believe, become a pastor. You already know, don't you? Yeah. Well, the thing about that is that I said everything I learned and everything I experienced undercut my faith. There's an experiential element to it. You're in a Christian culture. You're raised by Christian parents, and everything you know is Christian. You go right out of high school into Bible college, which I did, and then you go into ministry like I did, and you go into further school. Everything that I knew, everything I touched, everything I tasted was Christian. So you could no more talk me out of my faith. You could no longer reach me. I was unreachable. I was sitting at the highest levels, I was in a PhD program. And so there was no way I could ever become reasonable again. There's no way I could ever honestly examine my faith until the experiential things shook me like nothing else. There is something to the problem of suffering, and I write a lot about that, because it's the problem of suffering as I experienced it in my own life that caused me to rethink my faith. And when I did rethink my faith, I found it had no basis. It wasn't that I tried to undermine my faith. I sobbed. I'm not a sobbing kind of a man, but I remember sobbing as I was looking at the truth and trying to figure out, praying out to God, not about the circumstances, but as I was studying my faith honestly for the first time.
At that point, you were not wanting it to be not true. You were still wanting it to be true.
Oh, with every fiber in my being, I was, because that was what was getting me through those problems. But it's really a catch-22. That my faith was having me, I'm trusting God, everything's going to go all right. I was blackballed as a minister because of that. I couldn't, I was saying everything I had, and God was seeing, all of a sudden He opened a door that I could teach college, Bible college, afterward, and I thought, well, thank you, God. And but at the same time, it made me start to think, well, where really was God? Was it all in my mind? And so let me just restudy the things I already knew, because I had studied a lot and I knew a lot. And it was then those things that I studied all of a sudden kicked in gear. It's like a brainwashed person for the first time being confronted in an intervention. And the intervention was my life experiences. You could say, no, you can still maintain John just wanted to rebel. You could do that if you want. But I'm telling you that's not the case. They made me look at my faith from a brainwashed person for the first time, honestly, in my life.
Let me ask you this then: could you look back on it now and say, on some level, the whole situation with the being blackballed and the Linda and the reaction you got from the Christian community was on some level really a blessing because it helped awaken you to the truth?
Well, the human mind will always take a painful experience and transform it into a good thing over time. So it's just what the brain does. So I can say, yeah, good things have come out of it, but that doesn't mean that I wish I hadn't been raised as a Christian to begin with.
Well,
I
certainly.
raised as a Christian.
You're kind of like me, John, in the sense of what Mormons tell me all the time. They say, James, you can leave the Mormon church, but you can't leave us alone. And so maybe the same could be said with you, but we're kind of kindred spirits in that regard. And I just laughed out loud when I was watching your debate with David Wood, and he said, as an atheist with only believing he has a couple of decades, the remarkable dedication he has to spend so much of his waking hours writing about and talking about Christianity. You just got to respect that. Anyway, I do.
Well, I would be.
I can identify with that in what I've done in the area of trying to reach out to Mormons, and I know we're likely motivated similarly. We don't want them to be wrong. We don't want them to be, going in the wrong direction. And so I appreciate your books. I'd love to maybe next year or later this year, maybe take one of your other books, and after we go off the interview, maybe you can recommend what you think might be the best book for our book club to look at. But let me just say on behalf of our other co-founder, Bill Cluck, and the entire Atheist and Christian Book Club, thank you so much for being with us today and to take the time out of your schedule to be able to answer some of our questions. Thank you, John.
Thank you. These discussions are never ending, so we'll have to call it a day for now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So Ken, you can kind of identify with him, can't you? So is there a secret sin in your life at that time?
Yeah, I always wondered, well, what is wrong with me? And that was a question I genuinely asked myself. Well, what makes me different from other people that have no struggles with their faith? Well, what's wrong with me? That sort of thing. But who knows what's hidden in the depths of the mind, even to myself? I'm not aware of anything personally that sets me
said
apart.
the mind, you mean the brain, right?
But the question is,
okay, hit me.
But it's interesting, if you notice the passion that he had when he came to this experience and was reliving this experience, and then the authority that he took from that would be the same thing that the apostles did when they went through their experience and realized that they saw the truth and the passion that they had. So that's a reason why, again, that authority may have some value to it.
But the question is, Terry, what do you think? Do you think that it was the experience, the affair that caused him to lose his faith, or do you think it was when he rationally, objectively looked at the evidence?
Would he have rationally looked at it without that shock? It doesn't
That's what I'm asking.
Like it,
what do you think?
I don't think so from his own account.
It sounds like it was a very transformational. Sounds like it was a very transformational thing. Unexpected and.
Go ahead, Terry.
You could have two ways of looking at that. Something bad happens in your life, and you can fall onto your faith, fall back on your faith, and pray that, you know, God's going to come and help you out of this terrible situation that you've got yourself into, or you can say, what did I do and why? And that will lead you down a different path. I don't think that, I mean, yeah, he went through a difficult time, but I don't think that pushed him away from his church or his beliefs. I think that he was going through something terrible, and that caused him to question everything.
Did anybody else get the impression that the worst part for him, the most painful part, was the way the people in his church reacted to his being caught?
Well, a lot of, I see that a lot
Yeah.
in my own situation. I know that Christians are nice and loving, and they extend a helping hand, and they certainly do that when you believe the same way they do.
And keep in mind, I mean, he quotes William Lane Craig's own testimony, the guy who's reasonable faith personified. He was started down that path by a nice Christian girl he met.
Yeah.
So you can have these very emotional, impetus that leads you down a certain road that doesn't necessarily mean the destination you get to is incorrect.
Yeah, I could speak to that. My first bout of doubt was when I was in college, going to Christian college, Lateran University, just reading the Bible on my own. I had struggles with it. But then I met this girl from Columbia Bible College in South Carolina over spring break, and we hit it off, and it's like my doubts magically seem to start kind of fading away, you know, for...
You're thinking about other things, weren't you?
Exactly, yeah. She was a good Christian girl. And,
one day at a time.
Well, I mean, I told myself it was for intellectual reasons that I was coming back, but I mean, in retrospect, that could have been an influence in my life. And my experience is completely the opposite of Loftus's, in that the biggest thing putting the brakes on me leaving the faith, even as I was questioning intellectually the foundations of my faith, was that I loved the church. These were my people. This is what I grew up in. I had no conflicts with anybody. I was in the ministry. I felt like I was doing God's work. I was, the apple of God's eye, as the Psalms say, and bring salvation to the world, that sort of thing. How could you compete with that sort of level of significance in any other framework? So I was all in. It was for me. It was like a huge struggle to even think about giving it up in light of the connections I had with everybody in the faith.
Yeah, and I don't think that's really. I don't think it's fair to like you, Ken, or to John, to be able to just say, oh well, you had this. Well, in John's case, you had this bad experience. And well, I mean, Ken, you had a bad experience too once you started airing your doubts. People weren't very lovingly Christian.
Oh, I had a few of them, but by and large, I was surprised by the restraint that I felt that people, the deference people. I wasn't constantly attacked by people. Maybe online, where people are more free to express.
They're braver from their mother's basement, right?
Yeah, but my own family, I was grateful that they were not as belligerent as I had thought they might be. That's good.
I got a story. I went to this place called Crossroads, and the founder of it was this charismatic guy named Billy Riggs. He was going to be the next Billy Graham, and he was the best minister, best speaker I've ever heard in my life, even to this day, and I've heard a lot. And he immediately went and stole all of it. This is what drives me crazy about Christian youth ministers. He was the youth minister at a Methodist church. He stole all the people from that and started his own Crossroads. But he was fantastic anyway. He would have succeeded anyway. So then one day we're all sitting there, and he goes, I got an announcement I got to make next Sunday. And he says, I'm resigning from the church. I went and was arrested the other day at the church. I mean, can you imagine how humiliating this is? You're the senior pastor. You got this cushy life where you don't have to work for a living.
Wow.
And,
we need to talk.
We need to talk. I mean, he had associate ministers.
Play cards all day, right?
But anyway, so what he did, he was at a tanning booth, and he looked over the edge and was looking at the girl at the next tanning booth undressed. So that's why he got arrested. Totally humiliating. I can still remember this. The girl next to me was crying. Everybody was sobbing. But what's interesting is I talked to him about a year ago, and he's still a Christian. So he didn't leave the faith. He You know, and he actually now he has one of those miserable jobs you got to do to make a living. He's a public speaker, which isn't the worst job, but he's always on the road, a different city, talking to IBM this week, next week going to another city. It's terrible compared to the cushy life he could have had if he'd just gone to Charlotte or Texas. If you want to do secret sin, don't do it.
Let's face it, head pastors only work 2 days a week on Sunday morning. I mean, 2 hours a week.
Hey, believe me, I used to go to Providence Baptist, and we were all playing in a golf tournament, and we're seeing these scores like 10 under of the pastor's team. And I'm like, to get 10 under, you got to practice like 3 or 4 hours a day. And it turns out that the pastor hired the youth pastor was a golf pro.
Right.
And these guys, they teach a little Bible study on Wednesday night, do a couple hours counseling, and they're hitting the golf course. This is Providence.
I got to counter that. I attend a Bible church with my wife once a month, and it's in DeSoto, a big Bible church. And while I'm not on the same page belief-wise with the church. The pastor, he works his tail off, and all his staff under him. I mean, they're just genuine people, and they work hard. And you have to be an executive. It's like being an executive to run these things. Even the youth minister is like an executive.
But also, everybody wants you when they need you.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. I would.
Yeah, but this church at Providence, to this day, after 10 years, they get a year off. Can you imagine getting a year off, work paid?
And that'd be great.
Well, that's what they do there. It's just because they didn't want them to get burned out.
You need to go shadow.
It's like a sabbatical for universities.
Hey,
I was
let's
going
get
to
back
say
on topic.
university,
Yeah, you do the same thing.
Can we get back on topic?
Sure. Go ahead, Ron. Be my guest.
We're not 30 minutes, pass this out and wrap it up.
Okay, we're really at closing time, aren't we, Brady?
Yes, sir.
So we didn't really welcome our Facebook Live audience earlier. We appreciate that you stayed with us.
Of course, you couldn't hear the first 10 minutes anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry you couldn't hear the first 10 minutes, but we appreciate
They were
you
hearing okay
watching.
with the iPad, actually.
Were they?
I got
Great,
a couple of
great.
comments.
Oh, good,
on it.
good.
They said it was soft, and James was telling me to ask them to speak up, but he was on his watch party, not in the main discussion, so I didn't see that part to say just speak up a little, but they could hear. So.
Awesome.
Anybody have
That
a
was
last
good.
thought? Last chance, last word.
Or a first word at the end of the talk.
Brady, what else do we need to do?
We need to pass out those cards.
We did.
Oh, we did.
We did?
We
All
did, right
So we
after the
finished.
break.
We did.
You want one?
Well, we're good.
So
Right
be
after
here
the
or
break.
be square.
Oh, yeah. This should be great with this guy from Southwest Seminary. So have your questions ready. And great guy, and should have a really good crowd, don't you think, Ron?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm excited.
Well, as for me, I really appreciate you guys, every one of you. And it's been a privilege to get to know you a little bit. I really look forward to my trip over here once a month. One of these weeks, I might even make the trip on a Thursday night over to wherever it is, whatever.
Todd's at the IHOP on Thursday.
Is that an IHOP?
Yeah, at the IHOP, in the back of the IHOP. It's been going on 15 years. Some people just don't know when to quit. Like these churches in a strip mall, you got 5 people going to the church. It's like, it's not working. Quit. Just close it down.
And yet Bill comes and enjoys it.
And Israel was there last time, and I said, let's talk, are Christians delusional? And then Israel goes, how about atheists are delusional? So, he got me.
Well, maybe we're all just a brain in a jar someplace, and this is all a delusion.
Yeah.
It's all my end.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is great. See you all next month.
All right.
Ron, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Ron.
Thanks, Ron.
for coming in.